The morning sun cast golden beams through the stained-glass windows of St. Augustine's Church in Fairview, Kentucky, coloring the worn pews in warm hues of crimson and gold. It was the first Sunday of spring, and the congregation had gathered early for the special Community Safety and Faith service. As part of the event, the Fairview Police Department had sent one of their most respected officers, Daniel Ross, along with his canine partner. Ace. Ace was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, admired throughout the county, not just for his impeccable obedience, but also for his uncanny instincts. Children swarmed around him in the church lobby before the service began, patting his head and tugging gently at his ears. Ace, calm and patient, accepted the attention as if he understood the importance of public appearances. Pastor Ellis Monroe, a tall man in his 60s with a kind face and decades of faith behind him, welcomed the guests warmly. His sermon that day touched on trust, loyalty, and the importance of community watchfulness, tying in nicely with the police presence. The congregation nodded, uplifted by his words, as hymns echoed softly off the old wooden beams above. The serenity of the morning took an unexpected turn, just as the final prayer began. As Pastor Ellis stood before the altar, leading the closing benediction, Ace began to grow restless. He stood from his resting spot beside Daniel, ears pointed, body tense. His gaze locked upward toward the large wooden cross affixed to the rear wall of the church above the altar. Then he barked. At first, it was just one loud bark, then another, and another. Rapid, urgent. Heads turned. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. The quiet reverence of the moment shattered. Daniel tugged gently on the leash. Ace, quiet. But the dog was fixated, his muscles tight, fur rising along his spine. He barked again, louder, teeth bared, not in aggression, but in warning. Children clung to their parents. Whispers rippled through the pews. What's wrong with him? Why's he looking at the cross? Pastor Ellis paused mid-prayer, clearly thrown off. Is everything all right, Officer Ross? Daniel stood, trying to maintain composure. He's never done this before. Ace pulled harder, claws scrabbling against the polished wood floor as he tried to lunge forward. It took all of Daniel's strength to hold him back. His barking echoed off the vaulted ceilings, eerie and relentless. I'm sorry, Daniel said as he guided Ace outside. The moment they passed through the arched church doors, the dog went silent. He sat down just outside, breathing heavily, but no longer agitated. He looked back at the doors, alert, as if he were waiting for something. Inside, the congregation tried to recover the tone of the service, but the air had shifted. Something unspoken lingered, discomfort, maybe even fear. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, Pastor Ellis called Daniel. You know, that cross. It's been up there since before my time. My grandfather put it up in the 1940s. Never had a problem with it before. Daniel was silent on the other end of the line. I'm sure it's nothing, the pastor continued, though he didn't sound confident. Dogs are intuitive, I suppose. They are, Daniel finally replied, and Ace isn't easily spooked. That night, Daniel sat on his porch, watching the stars blink above his quiet neighborhood. Ace lay beside him, calm now, his breathing soft. But every so often, the dog would lift his head, ears pricked toward the distance, as if something, somewhere, was still calling out to him. Daniel didn't know what it was, but deep down, he knew Ace hadn't barked at shadows. Something was behind that cross, and they were going to find out what. Officer Daniel Ross had seen many strange things in his 12 years on the force car chases ending in cornfields, domestic disputes that turned into comedy skits, even a bank robber who apologized mid-theft. But Ace barking at a church cross? That stayed with him. For hours after Sunday service, The scene replayed in his mind. The dog's growls, the fixed stare, the overwhelming urgency in his body. He'd trained with Ace since the dog was a pup. They'd faced hostile suspects, stormed meth labs, and tracked down missing kids. But Ace had never reacted like that to a building, let alone a crossdot, by Monday morning. Daniel's instincts were in overdrive. After filing paperwork at the station, he drove back to St. Augustine's Church under the guise of routine patrol. The church parking lot was empty, but the doors were unlocked. Pastor Ellis had left a spare key under the mat, just in case. "Ace," Daniel said, crouching and clipping the leash. "Let's see what you were barking at." Inside, the air was cooler, and the pews cast long shadows in the morning light. As soon as Ace stepped past the entrance, he hesitated. His ears twitched. He sniffed the air. Then, silently, he walked down the center aisle, his body low, alert. No barking. Just slow, methodical movement. When they reached the altar, Ace sat, then stood again, and began pacing. His nose pointed at the large wooden cross above them. Then, he turned his head downward toward the floor beneath the altar platform. Daniel followed his gaze. The cross itself was mounted on the back wall of the sanctuary, rising about 10 feet above the altar's base. That wall had stood for over 80 years, made from smooth paneling framed with darker oak. At first glance, nothing looked out of place. But Ace began scratching lightly at a section of the floor near the altar, sniffing a faint seam in the wood. Daniel knelt, pressing his hand down. A soft draft brushed against his fingers. A vent, small, old, and partially hidden behind a lattice of floor molding. It was rusted around the edges, barely noticeable. He tugged a pocket knife from his belt and wedged the blade into the seam, popping the vent cover loose. Dust clouded the air. Ace backed up and sneezed. Daniel leaned in. From the opening came a strange scent, not sewage or mold, something older, metallic, musty, like forgotten earth. It reminded him of copper pennies and damp attics. He placed his flashlight into the vent. The beam revealed a narrow void beneath the altar, too small for a person to crawl through, but clearly part of a larger hidden space. Daniel pulled back and looked up at the cross again. "There's something behind here, buddy." Ace sat, tail twitching. Later that day, Daniel returned with blueprints from the city's records department. The church had been renovated several times, but the original 1894 structure was still partially intact. And sure enough, behind the wall where the cross was mounted, the blueprints showed a 6-foot cavity that wasn't marked in later records. "Looks like a crawl space," said Jerry Langford, the city's zoning clerk, peering over Daniel's shoulder. "Not listed in modern plans." "Guess they walled it off." Daniel nodded. "Or tried to hide it." When he returned to the church, Pastor Ellis was waiting. "I had my suspicions," Ellis confessed. "My grandfather was the lead pastor here for 40 years. He told me once this church was built on good intentions, but also on secrets, and sometimes those secrets rot." Ellis placed a hand on the altar. "You have my permission to open it, whatever's their God wants it found." Daniel looked at Ace, who was staring straight at the cross again. "All right, boy," Daniel whispered. "Let's uncover what they tried to bury." By Tuesday morning, Officer Daniel Ross stood inside St. Augustine's Church with a crowbar in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The sanctuary was silent, save for the occasional groan of aging floorboards. Pastor Ellis stood off to the side, arms crossed, his face drawn with unease. Ace sat quietly beside the altar, tail still, eyes fixed on the cross with the same eerie focus he'd shown on Sunday. The cross itself was massive, nearly 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide, carved from thick oak, darkened by time. It was bolted firmly into the rear wall, high above the altar. Removing it wasn't a task for one man. Daniel had called in Mitch Carter, a local carpenter and churchgoer, to help dismantle it without damaging the structure. Never thought I'd be unmounting the Lord's cross. Mitch muttered as he worked, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool temperature. But if this dog thinks there's something here. Together, they loosened the bolts, lowered the cross, and leaned it gently against a pew. Behind, it was a section of wall made from aged wooden panels, like the rest of the sanctuary, but one panel was different. It had no seams, no molding around the edge. Just flat, faded wood, smooth and solid. Looks like someone sealed this up on purpose. Mitch observed. Daniel tapped it. Hollow. He wedged the crowbar into a hairline crack and pried. The panel groaned, resisting like it hadn't been touched in generations. With one last heave, the wood popped loose, and a cloud of stale air rushed out. Heavy and cold. Ace let out a low growl. Behind the panel was a dark recess, narrow and dust-choked. Cobwebs clung to the edges. The crawl space ran about 8 feet. Deep and barely 4 feet high, just enough. Room for someone to slide through on hands and knees. You're not seriously going in there, are you? Mitch asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. He clipped a small flashlight to his shirt, looked down at Ace, and gave a nod. Let's go, partner. Ace entered first, crawling carefully. His nose twitched, tail low and still. Daniel followed, ducking, his head and inching forward through the cramped void. The wooden floor beneath them creaked faintly with every movement. Dust filled his throat. The smell was stronger now, metallic, earthy, and unmistakably old. About 10 feet in, the crawl space abruptly ended. At a brick wall, but this wasn't part of the original blueprints. Daniel tapped it hollow. The bricks were lighter in color than the surrounding foundation. Sloppy mortar work, done hastily as if someone had tried to seal it fast. Carved into the top center brick were 2 faint words. Forgive us. Daniel's skin prickled. You seeing this, Ace? Ace didn't bark. He sat, staring silently at the wall, tail still. Somebody sealed this up on purpose, Daniel whispered, and they felt guilty about it. He snapped a photo and backed out, Ace following closely behind. When he emerged, he found Pastor Ellis seated on the front pew, holding the Warren family Bible he always carried. I saw something strange in my grandfather's old journal last year, Ellis said. He wrote, not all foundations are holy. Some are laid with silence. I thought it was a metaphor. Maybe it wasn't, Daniel replied. That afternoon, Ellis contacted the church council and requested permission to break open the wall. The town's historical society was notified. Even the mayor made an appearance after hearing whispers about the discovery. We'll bring in a specialist, the mayor said. We need to be careful. If this is what I think it might be, this could rewrite part of this town's history. Daniel glanced at Ace, who now rested beside the altar, but still refused to look away from the wall. Whatever was behind those bricks, it wasn't just history. It was something that had been waiting to be found. Asterisk. By Thursday morning, the front lawn of St. Augustine's Church was crowded with onlookers and news vans. Word had spread fast. In a town like Fairview, secrets didn't stay buried long, especially when a police K-9 had practically sniffed them out during a Sunday service. Inside, the sanctuary was cordoned off with caution tape. Flashbulbs flickered through the stained glass as photographers tried to capture glimpses of the mystery wall. Pastor Ellis stood with arms folded, flanked by 2 members of the church board, who still weren't sure if opening the chamber was a blessing or a mistake. At the altar, a structural engineer named Marla Jennings knelt beside the sealed brick wall. She ran a gloved hand across the faded engraving. Forgive us. Her voice was low and even. This wasn't part of the original design, and whoever built it didn't want it discovered. She tapped one of the looser bricks. Wheel, go slow. Daniel Ross, now officially assigned to oversee the site, stood with Ace nearby. The dog, as if sensing the tension, sat alert but silent. He no longer barked. He just stared at the wall watching. Waiting. After an hour of careful work, the final layer of bricks came loose. A wave of stale, cold air rolled out of the chamber. The room behind the wall was small, no more than 6 by 8 feet. Dust and debris littered the floor. In the far corner sat several decayed wooden crates, their tops long ago nailed shut. Cobwebs clung to every surface. But what caught everyone's eye was the metal box in the center of the room square, rusted, with an old lock barely holding its shape. Marla stepped aside as Daniel moved forward. Using a pair of bolt cutters, he snapped the lock. The lid groaned open. Inside were papers, tied in faded red ribbon, letters, photographs, a pocket Bible wrapped in cloth, a child's hair ribbon. At the very bottom, an old church ledger, the name Holloway, written in careful cursive on the inside cover. Pastor Ellis approached slowly, lifting one of the photographs with trembling hands. It was sepia-toned, showing a young black family standing outside what looked like the church decades ago. A man, a woman, and 3 small children, all smiling. Behind them, unmistakably, was the cross now standing in the sanctuary. We're here, Ellis murmured. This family, they belong to this church. Daniel unfolded one of the letters. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Reverend Monroe, please. They've threatened us again. We don't know where else to go. You said the church was a sanctuary. If anything happens to us, I pray God sees our truth. Signed, Anna Holloway. Dated June 12, 1932. Mitch the carpenter let out a low whistle. This ain't just history. This is a cover-up. Daniel nodded grimly. And someone sealed it up like they hoped no one would ever find it. They examined the crates next. One contained old hymnals. Another had personal effects clothing, a pair of broken eyeglasses, a wooden toy train. Nothing valuable by today's standards. But together, they told a story, a family, a church, a desperate plea for help. And silence. Pastor Ellis sat heavily in a nearby pew, holding the Holloway family photo. My grandfather, he whispered. He was pastor here in the 30s. He never spoke of this, never once. Daniel sat beside him. Maybe he was trying to protect them. Or maybe he was protecting the church's reputation. The room was quiet, reverent until Ace let out a single bark, short, soft, and almost mournful. Daniel looked at him, then back at the wall. They had uncovered the physical proof of something long hidden. But the truth, the real truth, still buried in the stories behind these items, stories that were about to surface. The news spread quickly through Fairview. The story of the hidden chamber behind the church cross and the discovery of the Holloway family's belongings made headlines on the local news. People stopped in their tracks at the church lawn, some whispering, others outright demanding answers. Inside the church, the atmosphere was heavy. Pastor Ellis found himself fielding calls from distant relatives, curious townsfolk, and even reporters. The Holloway family had been forgotten for nearly a century, their story erased from Fairview's collective memory. But now, as the weight of the past settled in, it became clear that the silence had been deliberate. Daniel Ross sat in the modest church office, letters spread out before him. He carefully read through a bundle of letters penned by Anna Holloway. In 1932, pleas for help, descriptions of threats from local hate groups, and the final, heart-wrenching note that seemed to confirm the family's disappearance. Anna's words painted a vivid picture, a mother terrified for her children, seeking sanctuary in a church she believed would protect them. But the last letter ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if torn away by the urgency of her fear. Daniel looked up as Pastor Ellis entered the room, his usual calm replaced by sorrow. "My grandfather was the pastor then," Ellis said quietly. "He always spoke about forgiveness and grace. But I can't help wondering, did he do enough? Or was he complicit in the silence?" The question hung heavy between them. Outside, Ace sat silently by the altar. His barking had stopped since the discovery, but every time someone approached the cross, he watched with intense focus, as if guarding something unseen. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Lena Carter arrived at the church, clutching a small box. She claimed to have known the Holloway family as a child, and spoke softly of the rumors that had swirled for decades. "They were good people," Lena said, her voice trembling. "But people around here, they didn't want to talk about what happened, said it was safer to forget." She pulled out a faded photograph of the family, similar to the one found in the hidden chamber. "My grandmother told me they were chased out, maybe worse. But no one said exactly what." Daniel realized that the town's history was fractured, not just in documents, but in the memories and silence of its residents. The next step was clear. They needed to find the Holloway family's descendants. A search of public records and DNA testing on some of the personal items uncovered connections to living relatives in Georgia and Missouri. Daniel reached out, and soon, a small group of descendants agreed to travel to Fairview. Their arrival sparked a wave of emotion in the town. Some residents were welcoming, eager to confront the past. Others were defensive, fearing that dredging up old wounds would tarnish Fairview's image. During a town meeting, voices were raised. "Why dig up pain from a time gone by?" asked one longtime resident. "Because pain doesn't disappear just because you ignore it," replied a descendant firmly. Pastor Ellis took the podium. "We cannot change what happened," he said, voice steady. "But we can honor those who suffered in silence. This church was meant to be a sanctuary for all. It is time we live up to that promise." Daniel watched as Ace sat beside the pastor, head bowed, the once restless dog now calm, as if sharing the congregation's somber resolve. Outside the church, the cross stood tall, a silent witness to decades of secrets. And beneath it, the forgotten Holloways were no longer alone. The arrival of the Holloway descendants brought a new energy to Fairview, a mixture of hope, tension, and raw emotion. Among them was Marcus Holloway, a soft-spoken man in his early 40s, and his mother, Evelyn, who hadn't set foot in Kentucky since she was a girl. Both carried the weight of family stories passed down in whispers, but had never seen the town where their ancestors had vanished. Inside St. Augustine's, the church, filled with people eager to listen. News crews packed the pews, but the atmosphere was respectful. As if the past demanded reverence, Pastor Ellis stood before the congregation, flanked by Marcus and Evelyn. Marcus cleared his throat. "I grew up hearing stories about my grandparents, about how they loved this town and church, but how they disappeared without explanation. Until now." He gestured toward the cross. "Thanks to Officer Ross and Ace, we found proof of their last refuge." Evelyn's voice cracked as she added, "It's painful, but it's a chance to heal." The room was silent, the weight of generations pressing down on everyone. Daniel sat near the back, watching Ace now resting quietly but alert. The dog's eyes met his for a moment, as if acknowledging the journey they'd been on together. As the meeting progressed, local historians shared newspaper clippings, old church ledgers, and town records that had been tucked away or forgotten. They told a grim tale of racial tensions in 1930s Fairview, threats against black families, segregated churches, and acts of violence that the town had buried under decades of silence. Some documents suggested that the Holloways had sought sanctuary at St. Augustine's, but were betrayed by a faction within the church or town officials, leading to their disappearance. Pastor Ellis's face grew grim. My grandfather was a man of faith, but even men of faith can be flawed. An elderly man from the back stood. We all carry burdens, some heavier than others. Daniel knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Families divided, reputations questioned, and old wounds reopened. But the Holloway story was no longer a whisper, it was a voice. Outside the church, Lena Carter spoke quietly with reporters. This town needs to face its past, she said. Only then can it move forward. Later that evening, Daniel sat with Marcus and Evelyn on the church steps. The night air was cool, the stars bright. Marcus looked at Ace, who lay close by. Your dog saved us from being forgotten, Marcus said softly. Daniel smiled. He just followed his instincts. Sometimes that's enough. Ace lifted his head, ears twitching. Though he no longer barked at the cross, Daniel sensed the dog still felt its presence silent. Watching as the church bells tolled in the distance, Daniel reflected on the unfolding story. This was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning. A week after the Holloway descendants arrived in Fairview, the town reached a turning point. What had begun with the barking of a K-9 officer had grown into a reckoning, not just for a church, but for an entire community wrestling with a history long buried in silence. That Sunday, St. Augustine's Church was standing room only. The congregation was larger than it had ever been. Families who had not attended in years returned. People who once whispered about the past now stood ready to listen. At the front of the church, just below the once silent cross, sat a new structure. A memorial altar built from reclaimed wood, engraved with the names of the Holloway family. The church had voted unanimously to dedicate it permanently in their honor. Pastor Ellis, standing at the pulpit, took a deep breath before speaking. Today, we don't pretend to fix the past, but we choose to no longer ignore it. We acknowledge a family who came here for sanctuary and were met with silence. That silence ends now. Gasps rippled through the room as he opened his grandfather's old Bible, one that had been found in a locked drawer in the rectory. Tucked inside was a handwritten confession. In it, Reverend Monroe admitted he had allowed the Holloways to hide in the church, but, under pressure from town leaders and fearing violence, had helped smuggle them into the crawlspace. I sealed them in to keep them safe, he wrote. But I should have stood up. I should have fought harder. God forgive me. Tears rolled down Pastor Ellis's face as he read it aloud. Evelyn Holloway, seated in the front pew, wept openly, her hand clutched by her son Marcus. The pain of generations felt somehow lighter, still sharp, but shared. In a rare move, the Fairview City Council called a public hearing the next day. What had been unearthed at St. Augustine's prompted a broader look into the town's archives. It turned out the Holloways weren't the only family who had disappeared from the record books. A historical investigation was launched. Grants were proposed to fund memorials, and local schools added the Holloway story to the history curriculum. Daniel stood at the back of the meeting room, arms crossed, watching the town come alive with truth. He hadn't expected any of this. All he had done was trust his partner. Ace sat beside him, the proud German shepherd, calm and quiet, no longer needing to bark. As if he too understood that the fight was over, not because the pain had disappeared, but because the truth had finally been spoken. Later that evening, the mayor invited Daniel and Ace to City Hall for a special recognition ceremony. The mayor's voice rang through the crowd. It wasn't a crime tip, or a citizen report, or a historical dig that uncovered this story. It was a dog. A loyal, persistent, fearless dog who sensed what we had forgotten. And an officer who listened when no one else did. The audience stood and clapped as Daniel stepped up. Ace by his side. "I didn't do anything heroic," Daniel said. "I just followed the instincts of a partner who never failed me. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the past never stays buried. And if we don't face it, it finds ways to speak sometimes, through a bark." The crowd grew quiet, moved by the simplicity of his words. And at the edge of the room, the Holloway family watched with grateful eyes. Justice had not come with a gavel or a jury. It had come with truth, and that was enough to begin again. Asterisk, the faded walls had been restored. The once hidden chamber was now a transparent exhibit, carefully preserved and displayed behind glass, with photos of the Holloway family, excerpts from Anna's letters, and the rusted box that once held their final traces. The cross still stood high above the altar, but below it, the newly built Holloway Memorial Altar gleamed in the morning light, etched with the words, "Sanctuary is a promise, not a secret." On the anniversary of the discovery, the town gathered again, this time not for mourning, but for remembrance and unity. Pastor Ellis led a short service, but the day belonged to the Holloway descendants, who spoke of healing, resilience, and the courage it took for a community to confront its own silence. As the crowd stood for a moment of silence, Ace sat front and center beside the altar, head bowed, his breathing slow and even. He was older, now graying at the muzzle, eyes a little clouded, steps a bit slower. But there was still a regal calm to him, as though he understood everything that had happened in the past year. After the ceremony, children took turns petting Ace, some placing small flowers by his side. He accepted it all silently, like a guardian. Watching over something sacred. Daniel Ross stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching both the dog and the community he had served most of his life. A reporter approached him, notebook in hand. "Officer Ross," she said, "now that all this has come to light, what do you think it means that it was a dog who started it all?" Daniel looked down at Ace, who was now lying at the foot of the altar, tail thumping faintly. "I think dogs hear what we choose to ignore," Daniel said. Ace didn't bark at a cross. He barked at the weight behind it, the silence, the fear, the truth we didn't want to face. He reminded us that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly until someone's ready to listen. The reporter scribbled furiously, but Daniel didn't say more. Some things weren't meant to be turned into headlines. Some truths belong to the people who live them. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat on a bench under the large oak tree outside the church. Ace rested beside him, head in Daniel's lap. Marcus Holloway approached with his young daughter Naomi, in tow. She clutched a stuffed dog in one hand and a hand-drawn picture in the other. "We made this for Ace," Naomi said shyly, handing over the picture. It showed Ace sitting by a golden cross, a bright sun in the corner, and the words in crayon, "Thank you for finding my family." Daniel swallowed hard. He gently patted the drawing. "He'll treasure this." Marcus sat down beside him. "You changed everything, you know. You gave us back our name." Daniel shook his head. "We all did it. We just started with a bark." The two men sat in companionable silence, watching as families laughed, children played, and a once divided town leaned into the light. Ace lifted his head one last time toward the cross. His ears twitched. No growl, no bark, just quiet understanding. Truth finally spoken, a wrong finally recognized. And a promise finally kept. The end.